Hello, I'd like to talk a little bit about some sources of law at this point. And I do want to move something over here so you can see an example of a source of law. So let me get this moved onto the screen so that you can see an example of a source of law. Now, this would be legislation here. This is just one example of legislation enacted by Congress. And so it is in the United States Code. And for example, it talks about unlawful employment place practices. Section A says it shall be an unlawful employment practice for an employer to fail or refuse to hire or to discharge any individual or otherwise to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And there are several other similar things in this legislation and some more detailed burden of proof, different things that are here. All right, so we've got all these different sections here that were enacted by Congress. But there can be all kinds of questions that come up in real life that make it confusing to people. Congress probably did not anticipate every possible case, and sometimes there's confusion about how to construe the law. Sometimes there's a question of, has the case been proven? And so courts have to get involved with those questions. So remember, one source of law is legislation, and it's a very important source, and federal legislation is especially important. Now, another source that I want to see here, if I can get it to go backwards a little bit, here in LexisNexis, which is a great resource we have in our library. Let's see if I can get it back to the case. Yeah, here we go. Here is the case that I happened to just pull up. Ricci versus DeStefano et al. And so this case dealt with that statute, and it's a case about some white and Hispanic firefighters who brought actions against a city, and it was basically a situation where the city didn't certify some promotion examination results, and so there's a question about how the legislation applies in this case. And so this case ended up in the Supreme Court of the United States, and there is a rather lengthy opinion that was written by Justice Kennedy in this case. And you can see there's a lot of information here that you would read that would be part of case law. So this is a different source of law, case law. And so oftentimes case law and common law do relate with each other. And courts sometimes have to sort all of this out and determine, first of all, sometimes they have to determine, is legislation constitutional? Sometimes they have to interpret legislation. Sometimes they have to decide, did a plaintiff meet their burden of proof in proving their case, those types of things. And so case law is extremely important in a common law nation like the United States. So I did want you to take a look at that as two examples of sources of law. And we will spend some time looking at both, and we will read some very interesting court cases in this class. That's one of the things that makes law fun to study, is you can read about real life situations and what people have done in those situations. All right, let's talk through now the sources of law. There is a relationship here that I want you to keep in mind. There's federal law, which means law of the entire United States, and then there's state law. So each state has some of their own laws, Arkansas versus Tennessee versus Missouri versus California, and so forth. Federal law generally will supersede or override state law if there's a conflict. There can be some exceptions to that, but that's the general situation. Then there's another source of law, judicial decisions or case law, as we saw on the screen a few moments ago. Federal law, there's basically three areas to remember. Constitution, which is the highest law of the land, the U.S. Constitution. Then there's legislation enacted by Congress. If that legislation conflicts with the Constitution, that legislation will be void. Who decides that? The court system. So, very important part that courts play. Then, beneath all those two is the administrative law regulation. So, for example, if Congress enacts a law relating to environmental issues, and then the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, is empowered to make regulations in relation to that law, they may write a bunch of regulations. But if one of those regulations is in conflict with the original legislation, the legislation will win. Congress will win out. State law has a very similar structure. State constitution is the top. Statutes would be second. In other words, if a statute conflicts with the Constitution in the state, the Constitution wins. Then there are state administrative agencies that have regulatory law. That's subordinate to the state constitution and the statutes, but it is an important source of law. And then finally, there can be ordinances, laws within counties and cities, and that's the lowest part of the hierarchy. Now, what's the importance of judicial decisions? Well, as we've already mentioned, it interprets the constitutional, legislative, and regulatory laws. The decisions are made by judges, and they become precedents for future cases with similar facts. That's why we read case law in this class, and that's why attorneys have to read case law if they are doing a good job researching your case in many situations. There are things called citations, which helps the attorney or helps you locate the case in a library. And we will learn how to look those cases up using citations. Now, advantages. Stare decisis. If we have seen that the Arkansas Supreme Court has made a decision about an issue, and we have a similar issue in our business, well, it kind of helps us out to know, probably Arkansas Supreme Court is going to use stare decisis, let the decision stand, and that way I kind of have a secure knowledge that I know what the law is and I can plan accordingly. Judges follow precedents when they can. It ensures certainty, predictability, and efficiency. And it kind of gives everybody some boundaries. But there are some disadvantages. Case law is tough to make because there's a lot of cases. There's sometimes conflicting precedents. There's a difference between the holding and dicta. Sometimes judges will say too much. So maybe my holding should be limited to the case at hand, but I might say a bunch of extra stuff. The extra stuff is called dicta, and it's not as binding as the holding. Example the book gives is, suppose somebody is hit in the head by a foul ball at a baseball game. And the judge might say, and it's his or her opinion, that a spectator at a baseball game who is hit by a foul ball or by a baseball bat has assumed the risk, and so therefore the baseball team is not liable. Well, the holding should have been or is the person who is hit by the baseball, the foul ball, loses their case because the baseball team has no liability because there was an assumption of risk. However, the judge said something extra about baseball bats. That extra piece that was not necessary, but was just kind of thrown in there, is dicta, and it's less binding than the holding. Sometimes it's difficult to determine precedent, and sometimes precedent is rejected. So sometimes a court will say, we're not going to go by the precedent, or sometimes a court will say, we know we said something back, years ago, but we think times have changed, and we're going to change with them. Good example would be the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, where a court said, hey, it's fine to require that we have separate but equal train cars for people of different races. And then many years later, the same court rejected that precedent and said, no, separate but equal is not right, and we're not going to segregate schools anymore because we finally have wised up. We've gotten smarter, we've become better, and we need to know better than that. So sometimes precedent can be rejected. So stare decisis does not always ensure the best result, and we can't always count on stare decisis, but it does help in many cases. There can also be conflicts of laws. So sometimes laws in one jurisdiction may be different than the laws in another jurisdiction, and they can be in conflict, and then there has to be some determination of which state's laws apply, for example. Now, hierarchy of sources of law, we've kind of already said this. Here is sort of the order here. Let me go back. Constitutions, number 1. Congress, statutes, number 2. Federal administration regulation, number 3. Then beneath that is state constitution, state statutes. Then beneath that, state administration, the state administrative regulation, local ordinances, and then case law is at the bottom. However, case law is important because it may be interpreting the U.S. Constitution, a state statute, etc. So it's very important. But let's just say today a judge says that some certain situation exists in the law. If Congress enacts a statute that conflicts with that, Congress is generally going to win, unless their statute was somehow unconstitutional. All right, there are a few other things to note. There are sanctions in the law, which are very important, and I won't spend a lot of time here, but remember, the punishments for crimes are generally death, imprisonment, fine, removal, disqualification. If it's a public wrong against society, you have those kind of punishments. In this class, we'll deal more with breach of contract and torts and those types of things. And those do not send you to jail, but there are money damages, compensatory damages, consequential damages, specific performance, those types of things for breach of contract. For tort, there can be money damages. There can also be punitive damages, and we will talk about that in some tort cases. There are also sanctions for violating statutes and regulations, which helps people know their boundaries. Those are similar to those imposed for criminal conduct, breach of contract, or torts. There may be a fine, for example. All of these things do help define boundaries. It's very important that laws be enforced. And so those sanctions are important. And we'll get into more detail about sanctions at another time and as we get into the different chapters. So thank you very much for taking my class. I hope that you will contact me if you do have questions, and I hope to see you soon.